Welcome everyone to today's research seminar. Today we have Professor Emeritus Bo Rothstein with us, who will present a talk with the title, Should the Swedish Public Healthcare be Nationalized? Consequences for Democracy, Legitimacy and Accountability. And before I give the word to Bo, I would like to say a few words about Bo to those of you who for some reason are not familiar with Bo. I think most of you are. Bo Rothstein is currently Professor Emeritus in Political Science from University of Gothenburg, but he's also an affiliated researcher here at Future Studies, which we are of course very happy about. During his career, he's held various prestigious positions. He's been at Oxford University, he's been at Blavatnik School of Government and Nuffield College. He's been at the University of Uppsala, and he has been a visiting fellow at universities like Cornell University, Harvard University, Stanford University, and so on. His research is concentrated on issues of the quality of government and issues like corruption, clientelism, social justice, welfare policies, and human well-being. He's written so many books that I'm not going to account for them here. Instead, I'm going to give the word to Bo, and the floor is yours for, I think, approximately 45 minutes, right? 45 minutes to an hour. Thank you.
Thank you, Moa. I now define myself as a research tramp. I go around to places like this for a few weeks. It's a great pleasure to be here, as always. I'm very, very happy for this invitation. Yeah, this is something that is maybe a little out of the box. Let me give a little background here. This is from a public investigation, a classic Swedish thing. It was set up by the current government in June 2023. It's politically initiated by one of the four parties in the current coalition government, the Christian Democratic Party. It's, you can say, one of their pet issues. The committee consists of 12 members from the parliament. There is an impartial chairperson. There is a secretariat of 6 persons. They are all very able civil servants. There are 25 so-called experts. Many of them are representatives of interest organizations like the unions or patient organizations, and so the word expert is maybe a little overblown here. The final report from this committee is to be delivered in June 2025, and the topic is, of course, should the Swedish healthcare be moved from where the responsibility is now, the 21 regions, to the state. I was appointed and asked to be part of this investigation in in November 2023. Sorry for the misspelling. And I agreed to write this report in January, and it's basically a month's work. So this is not research. I'm compiling the research to try actually to answer a question about the future. What will happen in the future if the Swedish healthcare would be transferred to the state? So this is a exercise, you can say, not in applied research, but in applying research. There is, of course, lots of research in Sweden about the healthcare system. And there is, of course, also lots of research about how the Swedish democracy works, not least from my former department in Gothenburg, who have studied elections and parties and responsibility. But these two have never been connected. And interestingly enough, there is hardly any research about the regional democracy in Sweden. Very, very few. I think there are 2 dissertations back in the 1970s. And if you, for example, look in the big book that my dear colleagues have produced about the recent elections based on those tons of survey material, and now you can get the book in PDF and you can search for the word region. Nothing. And it's also actually quite interesting because one of the books that have been most important for my generation of political scientists is about regions. This is Robert Putnam's famous Making Democracy Work, which is a study about regions in Italy. But it has not transferred at all to our part of the world. There is also hardly anything about the democratic quality of the healthcare system, interestingly enough. I thought first I would do a comparative study, see if there are in other countries studies about the democratic aspects of the healthcare system. But it's lots of policy studies, but those specific things, democracy, accountability, legitimacy, couldn't find anything. This is also strange because healthcare issues are on top when Swedes are asked about which political issues they care most about. And healthcare is about 90% of what 21 regions are doing. From my research group, the Quality of Government Institute, we actually done a lot of regional studies. We were asked some 12 years ago by the European Union Special Secretariat for Regional Policy to see if we could study our pet topic, quality of government in the regions in Europe. Europe is divided into the EU into some 200 sort of nuts, they are called, regions. And they were a little sad because they were sending tons of money to less developed regions, hoping it would sort of improve the situation, but very little. And they thought maybe this has something to do with our pet topic. We have asked people, I think, together now it's more than 250,000 people in 5 such surveys. About how they perceive quality, level of corruption and transparency in 5 areas. It's the healthcare system, the police and the educational system. And just want to show you a nice map of this. Dark blue is good, dark red is bad. And you can see there are quite some interesting regional differences in Europe. My second home country, Italy, is maybe the most interesting one. So as you can see, this is the country where the regional differences are just stunning. I will not talk more about this, but we have a lot of data about the European regions here. Now, why was this investigation set up? If you read the instructions from the government, they point at a number of things. It's quite a big problem that the healthcare that is provided by the regions is very unequal. I was stunned when I read that we know that healthcare is very much connected to social position. However, in Sweden, the chance of surviving a cancer diagnosis, it's more dependent on which region you live in than your social position. And I couldn't believe this, but it's actually the case. So we have huge differences here. We have a number of laws, for example, the Vårdgaranti, the care guarantee, that are not implemented by the regions. And this here is the first surprise for me. Usually when the government and the parliament enacts a law and you break the law, something bad happens to you, right? You pay a fine or something else. Or if it's really bad, you can go to prison. When the regions systematically break the laws about how healthcare is going to provide it, they get more money. So it's a kind of twisted system here when it comes to incentives, you can say. There are long waiting times, few hospitals bed, overcrowding, quite low results when patients are asked how they are met. taken seriously or feeling that they have been treated fairly and so on. Quite low results. Large parts of the healthcare personnel are quite dissatisfied with their working conditions. Difficulties for the national government to influence the provision of healthcare. Problems steering healthcare during the corona crisis was very obvious. And then we have this special organization, the interest organization for local municipalities and regions. And that is unclear the role it has compared to the national authorities in this area. So the main aim of my report is to try to answer the question, would a transfer of, I don't know if this is the right translation, mandatorship from the regions to the state increase or decrease the degree of democracy, legitimacy and citizens' accountability, possibilities of accountability? And what would this mean for dealing with these and other problems in healthcare? So would we see an increase or a decrease if we would make this offer? No, sorry, wrong. Yeah, if you're going to ask this, you have to start, I think, with first defining what you mean by democracy here. And the well-known Vidam Institute in Gothenburg present 5 different models of democracy: representative, electoral, liberal, participatory, deliberate, egalitarian democracy. And when I tried to figure out which of these different types of democratic model that fits the Swedish democracy best, I think it's fair to say it's a representative electoral democracy with some liberal traits. That would be my verdict. But Sweden is actually also a neo-corporatist democracy. In the 1980s, 2 books were published that had a great influence on the debate in Sweden. One was Peter Katzenstein's Small States in Word Market, and another was, the main author was Philip Schmitter, and they pointed at that sort of this pluralist idea of democracy doesn't fit many of the European countries. Here, instead, we have a system where the state tried to solve problems by entering into deals with powerful interest organizations. This was very dominant in Sweden until the 1990s, especially in labor market issues and agriculture, but also in many other areas. Just to give you a number, in 1986, the Swedish Blue-Collar Central Union, LO, had 665 representatives in more than 500 committees, national agencies and other corporatist bodies. So this was big. It was closed in the early 1990s for various reasons. This is quite effective type of governing, but it's not really so democratic, you can say, because these interest organizations, their accountability can of course be questioned. But I will come back to why this is important. Now, when you're going to think about democracy, we usually think a country is either democratic or it's not democratic. But I like thought experiments. This was Einstein's best idea, I think, to do the thought experiments. And if you just think for a second about democracy, you can say the Danish democracy is actually very different from the Swiss democracy. That is very different from the Canadian democracy. So let's do it here. So if you take some of the standard institutions in a democracy and see how they can vary, you can have a 2-party system or a multi-party system. You can have presidentialism or parliamentarism, 2-chamber system or single-chamber system. You can have a unitary state. You can have a federal state. You can have strong or weak individual rights. You can have very independent court with judicial review, or very weak without judicial review. The public administration can be meritocratic or political with recruitment. You can have an independent or politically controlled national audit office weak versus strong decentralization, and you can have many referendums or no referendums. Now, just think about it. If you just think that these are dichotomous, and actually many of them are not, 2 up to 10 is 1028. That means we have 1028 ways, at least, to organize a democracy. And I wanted to send this out because I wanted to set this sort of out-of-the-box thinking in the mindset of the 12 parliamentarians in the investigation, to think more sort of creatively about what we are doing here. Now, legitimacy. What do the Swedish people think about its healthcare system? It's actually very difficult to say if you look at the data. Trust in the healthcare system is very high. On a scale that can go from -100 to +100, it's around +80. Trust in doctors and nurses is even higher. You get +90. 1 year the university professors beat them, but that's a number of years ago. But it's utterly high. The medical results, according to experts, are very high, sometimes even world class. If you ask people not about trust, but job performance, healthcare is considerably lower. It's still positive, but go from +80 to +20. And it's below, for example, preschools or things like that. So if you ask what do you think how they are actually performing, you get a much lower figure. If you ask people about what they think about how use of the healthcare system, it's a lot more negative. And there is very low trust in those who run the system, the politicians or the bureaucrats. And compared to other countries, comparative low when it comes to waiting times, contact with healthcare professionals and accessibility. And Sweden is lower when 10 Western countries are surveyed on when people feel that if they are being treated fairly or taken seriously. So there is a huge gap between the actual performance, medical performance, and what people think about how they are sort of handled in the system. Now, if you're going to say something about democracy, you must have an idea how democracy works. And this is my favorite book, Democracy for Realists, Why Elections Do Not Produce Responsive Government, written by 2 of the most respected scholars in this field, Aachen and Bartel. I think they make a very good case showing that this popular idea that democracy can result in the exercise of the will of the people. Absolutely not. That's not how it works. People know too little, the issues are too complicated, they are too little engaged, and so on and so forth. And it's also important to remember when representative democracy was when they came up with the idea in the 18th century, will of the people was not the main thing. It was sort of a moderated will of the people by the political elite. The best you can hope for, according to Aachen and Bartel, is retrospective voting, that you vote the rascals out of office. If you sort of you look in the back mirror and say, how have they performed? Is it good enough? But this is also quite complicated. What they show is that the electorate put blame on politicians for things they cannot handle. Natural disasters, for example. Too short-sighted and so on. In my view, the normatively good things with democracy actually comes from other things than elections. This is like liberal rights, including minority rights, gender equality, the rule of law, and that we have what you can call epistemically independent institutions. Free universities, independent courts. Some people say an independent central bank is good. I'm not so convinced about that, but maybe. and of course also independent cultural institutions. And this is of course now under threat with the increase of populist parties in power, but this is a different thing. So this is a quote from Bruce Gilley. He surveyed, used word value survey data to survey some 78 countries, trying to figure out what may people think that their government is legitimate. And this comes with quite some surprise. Yes, this is a long quote. I won't read it, but it's in the paper. But yes, democratic rights are important, voting and free speech and so. What you get out of the system, pensions and so, healthcare, is important. But both these are far less important than things that are connected to what is called good governance. Rule of law, control of corruption, government effectiveness. So when people make a stand, if they sort of think that their government is legitimate, it's the output side that is important, not the input side. The input side is important, but not as important as the output side. Now, most of my colleagues in political theory, they cannot handle this. They put their name in ink, in blood, that it's sort of democratic rights that give the system legitimacy. I say we because it's my colleague in the Cog Institute, have carried out a number of efforts to see if this holds, and it does, very clearly so. And my way of thinking of this runs like this. So say, in elections around the world, a third of the electorate do not bother to vote, right? Even fewer take part in demonstrations, write op-ed articles, makes public speeches and so on. What now, if you do not exercise or cannot exercise your democratic rights, what would happen with your life? If you don't vote in the next election, what will happen? Nothing. Your life just carries on, right? However, if the police don't protect you because you are a minority, if the fire brigade don't come because you call from the wrong part of the city, if you cannot get health care to your children because you cannot afford to pay the bribes at the hospital, and if you do not get that job that you are most qualified for because you're a woman or a minority, really bad things happen with your life. So my point is, it's not unreasonable if you think about the micro logic for people to take this position. The output side is more important than the input side. And of course, healthcare is very much about the output side. Because you can ask, what should democracy in healthcare be about? Localization, yes. People don't like when the hospital is closed down. Fine. Here you see it. Private financing, hardly anyone in Sweden arguing for that we should change the financing to a private system in Sweden. Private production to some extent, but not so much. Type of treatment, no. One colleague to me in Gothenburg carried out an experiment trying to see if people had an idea what should be prioritized in healthcare, if they had a choice between more money to psychiatric clinics or more money to help people who cannot have children get kids and so on. People don't want to take this. They think this is something for the experts. This is not something where we should have a democratic influence in. Economic resources, yeah, to some extent, but if you look in most of the regions, the difference between the minority and the majority's budget is hardly visible. Actually, there was a program in Swedish television when they asked the members of the regional parliament if they could see which of the budgets was theirs and which was from the other side. And many couldn't, actually. So My conclusion is there is quite a limited area for democratic decision making when it comes to healthcare. The regional democracy in Sweden, does it work? The short answer is a resounding no. There is too little interest, knowledge, information. People do not know about the regional parties. They do not know about the regional politicians. They have not formed an opinion. They have not put in the effort to understand what is going on. A majority of Swedes actually think that it is the state who run the healthcare system, not the regions. Among election studies people at my department, the regional elections are known as the hidden or the forgotten election. It's probably that voting at 3 different political levels on the same day put too high demands on the Swedish voters. It's too much information. You should make an opinion what is going on at your local community, municipality or city. You should have an opinion about what goes on at the national level and then also at the regional level. And it's since we have this very unusual type of system where you vote on all levels on the same day. Most countries separate them. I think this is too much. There is vote splitting. People vote on one party in the national election and another in the regional and another in the local elections. And you can think that this is because they actually make an informed decision. They don't. It's more likely because party identification has become much weaker in Sweden. So you used to be a die-hard moderate or die-hard social democrat, not so much anymore. If you actually look at it, and this has just been done, how to explain vote splitting. 40% of those who split their vote states that it is because what is going on in the local municipality or city. 10% say it's because what is going on in national politics, and only 6% say it has to do with regional politics. So it's 94% of those who split their vote and vote at a different party in the regional election don't do this because it was going on at the region. Yeah. Does democratic accountability work at the regional level? It's made more difficult because there is a legally mandatory coalition government that has been sort of in the Swedish constitution. There has to be a coalition government. Now this has been tricked, so the parties have sort of installed some kind of quasi-parliamentarism, but this makes it very difficult to see who is actually governing the region. A change of majority means that the chairman of the executive boards change, so instead of being the chairman, the opposition will be the vice chairman. That is what goes on. And this, of course, makes it complicated for voters to understand. This is what the people who study this more carefully than I conclude. Coalition government and competitive democracy coexist in such an intricate and informal way that it can be difficult for citizens to fully understand how local politics works. This risks weakening the conditions for voters' accountability. Yeah, a majority of Swedes actually believe that it is the state who run public healthcare. And we do have lots of debate at the national level and in parliament about healthcare. They actually take a stand. They're not saying this is not for us. You have to this has to be dealt for by the regions. There are constant debates at the national level about this. And the state funnels considerable amount of money to the regions. We also have almost a battalion of national coordinators for various things in this area. for psychiatric care and many other things. I think last time I counted, they were 22 national coordinators for various things in the healthcare sector. Now, if the regions are going to take the responsibility, why do you need a lot of national coordinators? And the reason I pointed at corporatism is that I think that the corporatist arrangement between the national government and the Swedish Association for Regions and Local Municipalities makes it in practice impossible to understand where accountability is located. So what happens in many areas is that the state enters into an agreement with this organization and said, here is tons of money, you have to do this and this and this. But these agreements, it's very difficult to understand who has the responsibility for what. On top of this, it turns out that it's almost impossible to see where the money goes. This agreement over the years for shoring up primary care, it's 23 billion Swedish crowns. Nobody can show any result of this. It's actually stunning. So this is a quite problematic organization. It's actually an interest organization that has become very influential. I had two seminars with doctors from the Swedish Associations of Doctors, Läkarförbundet. And what they tell me is two things. Most Swedish doctors who work in the public system think that this organization is a national authority. They also say, and this is a little worrying, I have this from the chairman of the Swedish doctors who are into infection medical healthcare. They say, we cannot give the patient what we think is the medically most substantiated treatment because of the instructions from this organization. Because they have taken control over how medical knowledge should be applied. It's also governed by coalition of the main parties. It acts and is perceived as a national authority. It got a lot of criticism for lack of activity during COVID. And this type of sort of corporatist thinking seems to be like in the DNA of Swedish governments, both left and right. When there is a serious problem, we really don't know what to do, go into a deal with the main interest organization. The main question is, of course, for this report, would a nationalization lead to improved democracy, legitimacy and accountability given what I have said so far? Accountability, I say maybe. It would be sort of clear that it is the government who has responsibility for healthcare, and voters could then more clearly, when they cast their vote, do this having in mind how they perceive that healthcare has been handled by the current government. However, the state has many areas of responsibility: social service, defense, the economy. So it's not clear that healthcare would be sort of the main thing, while since it is 90% of what the regions are doing, it's more likely that you should be able, with a different system, I say, to have accountability for healthcare, since it's so dominant for the regions. But I have news: the Swedish state cannot change the Swedish geography. The country is like it is. And they cannot change that we have some of the regions with very, very small populations. The smallest regions have 50,000 and the largest 2 million. So, and the idea that these entities should be able to give healthcare at the same quality level is, I cannot fathom that. Also, since one of the big problem is to get people to work in remote areas of the country, the Swedish state cannot order people to do this. You could have some incentives. I know in France, for example, you having strong economic incentives for doctors and nurses to go to less populated areas. And from organizational theory, I should also say, it was Moa said I'm a political scientist. Basically, I'm a public administration scholar and organizational theorist masquerading as a political scientist. And one thing you can learn from organizational theory is that some types of organizations are dominated by what is called loose coupling, meaning that what happens at the grassroots level is only loosely coupled to the central directives. And especially areas like education and healthcare, this is very much so. And if you take this seriously, you also, Sweden has, as many of you know, a very special type of public administration. We don't have large ministries like in many countries, Ministry of Healthcare, for example. Our Ministry of Healthcare, or the social department, it has some 300 people. It's very small. The idea that this organization should be able to actually govern the gigantic Swedish healthcare system doesn't exist. So you would have to put up a national public administration of the special Swedish kind, ämbetsverk. It would have to be a pretty large operation, I think. I would guess 800-900 people at least. And you would have to have then regional and sub-regional state administrations, and maybe also at the local level. We are talking about if those who are now working in administration would move over and be employed civil servants by the state, it's around 19,000 people today. That's what you talk about. Now, the problem is here, who would in reality govern this huge national bureaucracy? When we had the corporatist model, it did provide members to the administrative boards, both at the regional level and at the national level, who functioned somehow as a check on the administration. So take, for example, the Labour Market Board had members from the Employers' Federation and the unions and so on. I do not defend this as a perfect system, but it was actually that the bureaucrats had directly some other people coming from the outside that were checking that they had to have some responsibility too. It doesn't no longer exist. This current system of layman influence over national administration is not functional. They are called, I cannot translate it, insynsråd, transparency council. They meet 2 or 3 times a year and they have no real power. So we have not replaced the corporatist system with some other type of sort of citizens' control over what the bureaucracy is doing. And I cannot really see how this would work in this area. So for me, it's very hard to see that the nationalized system would improve democracy, legitimacy, or accountability. It doesn't come up to me to give special advice here to the investigation, but my first conclusion is yes, maybe a full nationalization could strengthen the opportunities for democratic accountability, but it would also entail an extensive organizational and implementation problems that could imply that the opportunities for actually effective political accountability do not materialize. It's not easy to govern these gigantic bureaucracies. So the real influence of the elected representatives from whom accountability would be demanded over important parts of the activities would in all probability be very small. Instead, a large part of influence in such a system would be exercised, of course, by the civil servants and by the professions that work. That is what we would see. Then is the question, could you do something with the dysfunctional regional democracy? I think so. And this is why I made these thought experiments. There are, at least in theory, endless possibility to change the regional democracy. I just put up a few examples. We could have a separate election day. Most countries have that. And Sweden is actually a country that have election most seldom, every 4th year. I think this is a record in time between elections among democracies. Would this mean a lower turnout? Yes. But I think one have to think about, if you have a turnout now a little more than 80% and 70% have no idea what they are voting about, is that worse, better than if you have a turnout of 60% where maybe 50% would know what they are voting about? Difficult to say. Also, I think, and this is maybe a little outside argument, I think the democracy in Sweden would benefit from having more elections. It would vitalize the political parties that are now, I think, in serious trouble because lack of members and activity. Is it fun to be a member of a political party and go to endless meetings? No. What is fun? Election campaigns, of course. So I think this would vitalize. You could have introduce straight parliamentarism in the system. That would be quite easy. You can take away some power from this organization and end this type of agreement policy. I think that would improve much. You could also, in order to really show that this is another election, you could introduce a different election system. My personal favorite is quite unknown in Sweden. It's the single transferable vote system. I can talk a long time about that. But there are many ways you can have a different election system here that would sort of really make it clear for voters that this is something different than voting in the national elections. And you could have a directly elected regional sort of president like you have in many countries, for example in Italy. And in the United States. So then I think, of course, could the role of the national government in this system be improved? I think yes, we could have laws that are implemented. There is a kind of Orwellian language now, you say people have guarantee to care. There is no guarantee, it's ba. I think the incentive structure for the regions should be changed. So breaking the law would have serious consequences for them. I think we should have fewer regions. They have done this in Denmark, in Norway. They have some similar reform in Finland. These very small regions cannot really produce what they are supposed to produce. You can, as I mentioned, change the laws, how the regions are to be governed, introducing more straight parliamentarism. The legal rights of patients is very unclear in Sweden. We have a system of legal rights that makes it directed to the producers. So the producers have an obligation to provide care, but the patients cannot claim any rights. And that could be changed here. You could also have a law that introduced mandatory audit system in the regions. We can show that mandatory audit system that are independent. They are now dependent and basically appointed by the politicians. If you had an independent, like we have in the central government, an independent national audit system, we could have independent regional such systems. So maybe this gap that I think is fascinating between good medical results and bad experiences by the patients, then by this could be closed. And I rest my case. Thank you.
Thank you, Bo, for this very interesting talk.
Do I get points for being on the minute, 45 minutes?
Yes, you do.
Thanks.
Welcome to the Q&A, everyone. Those of you who are here in the audience, if you would like to ask Bo a question, you raise your hand. And once the discussion has started, maybe you want to ask a question related to another question, then you raise your finger. So for a new question, it's the hand, and for a follow-up, it's the finger, like this. The same for you, those of you who are online. And because we are different researchers and from different organizations here, please also tell us where you are from, so that we can follow up that everyone is represented. And also note that the first 30 minutes of this discussion is recorded. So now the floor is open for questions. Valdemar, you will get the microphone so that we can all hear you.
Thank you, Valdemar Ringdahl, Institute of Future Studies. I would like to know a bit more about your view upon of the centralization of the healthcare system. After all, the Swedish state is a quite centralized entity and makes quite a lot of laws, and as you told, it also gives money and subsidies to the regions. So isn't it that the regions are rather controlled in their actual policies by centralized law? And perhaps one way of democratizing and vitalizing democracy could be that regions are actually allowed to do radical choices in their actual policy and diverge from other regions.
Yes, how controlled they are is was shown very clearly during COVID. What happened with COVID, as you know, came in early March. The World Health Organization came out and say what the countries should do is test, test, test. In many countries, testing started quickly. In Sweden, it came 3 months later. Why? Because the regions refused to do what the government wanted until they got more money. It was a kind of blackmail policy. You have then our then Minister of Healthcare sitting in public television and saying, getting the question, why hasn't the testing started? We had capacity. And she said, I don't know. We have capacity. We have the money. We have everything. I cannot say why the testing hasn't started. And it didn't start because the regions refused. How should you think about this? My thinking is like this. COVID can be thought of as an invasion by an enemy army. And when the army has invaded and taken a part of the country, our Minister of Defense, together with the High Command in military, decides that we should make a counterattack on day one on time X. Order goes out to the 21 commanders of the Swedish regiments that they should come with their troops and arms, and so we should beat the enemy. Nah, a third of them says, we haven't got enough money, so we're not coming. And a third says, we have this just-in-time production, so our soldiers don't have the right equipment yet. This is not how it can work. And I think this is the main problem with, it doesn't work in crisis. Should you allow for more variation? you could, of course, but the Swedish law is very clear that there shouldn't be any variation. Everyone should have the right to. I don't have it in my mindset now, but it's very clear that it shouldn't depend on which region you live in, how good and type of care you get. So this is very much an unlawful thing, this variation that we see. And then, of course, we have this actual variation that I mentioned before, that the actual provision varies a lot. So take, for example, in immunization. In some regions you get free immunization if you're over 65 or under, in others not. So there is a lot of variation actually going on because of the regions. Yeah, long answer to a complicated question.
Are you happy with this answer, Valdemar?
I think it's clarified some of the question, at least the response, and I understand some of the issues of trying another approach. But I'm certain that the question will be posed many times more.
Thank you. Then Karim is next.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks. This was very interesting. I had a question about whether we can draw any lessons from how the school used to work in Sweden, because the school used to be national, and it was also a huge sector of society with extensive bureaucracy and civil service and so on and so forth. Did it work well, or what can we learn from that experience or that example?
Yeah, I think I cite and write a little section about this in the report. I do. There was a similar report carried out a few years ago by my colleague in Uppsala, Leif Levin. And his statement is that this abdication of the central government has not meant good things for the quality of the schools. No. But it's very hard to make these comparisons. For example, we have had a nationalization of the police in the 1960s. What can you say? One thing you can say with the nationalization of the police for sure is that many local police offices and stations has been closed. That is very clear. But it's very difficult to say anything about if this has improved or made the actual policing of the Swedish society better. But I think there are very few who study the school system who say that this decentralization, not to the regions, but to the local cities and municipalities, has meant an improvement of our educational system. I think it would be difficult to find scholars or people knowledgeable about the educational system who would agree with that.
So I was maybe more specifically thinking about, so you said that the likely outcome for nationalization of the healthcare system would be that it would empower professionals and civil servants, but it would not necessarily give national politicians an increased mandate. How was it in the school arena? Did national politicians have influence on schools, or was it only in the hands of kind of the bureaucracy and the professionals?
I wrote my dissertation about the Swedish school system, half of it at least, so I should know. Yes, I would say so. They had a strong influence of three things. Meritocracy in the system. Who could become a teacher and a school principal? Also the curriculum. And at that time we also didn't have this system where you could have a school outside the public system with a special orientation. So we had a more more, and they then I think what they didn't manage to do was to do something about social mobility through the school system. That was when it started. It was big hopes that you would increase the number of children from working class homes to go to universities. That didn't happen.
Then Marcus is next.
Okay, thanks a lot. So I actually have two questions. So if I'm allowed, I might ask both of them at the same time. Otherwise, I'll wait. I don't know if I perhaps detected this somewhat of like a shift in focus from where you started your talk to where you ended up. So please correct me if I'm wrong. But as I listened to the talk, I know you started with these 10 problems identified by politicians, essentially. And very high on that list is the problem with, depending on where you live, you receive different quality of healthcare. But then, I mean, as the talk progressed, it seemed to me like you focused more and more on whether nationalization could improve some other measures, for instance, accountability and values that we associate with democracy. So first, I mean, if this is correct, why focus on these sort of outputs and assessment criteria? So one suggestion, I guess, would be that one of the problems with the current way of organizing the healthcare system is that accountability is too low because of the regional organization, right? And then you basically ask whether a shift toward the state level could improve that. But so is this correct? And am I right to interpret your answer to this question as a resounding no because of all the problems that you mentioned? So, but on the other hand, that then the other alternatives, strengthening regional democracy to begin with, that's the take-home message today, that we should emphasize these kinds of measures in order to increase accountability and then get at the 10 problems identified at the. Is this a correct interpretation?
Yeah. I should have been more clear about this. The 10 or 8 problems that they come from the government. That is why when they motivate why they have put this investigation running, this is what they say. But none of them is about democracy, accountability and legitimacy. This has been my assignment. The committee have later said we also need to know something about this. And it's interesting that when the government sets up this commission, they do not mention democracy, legitimacy and accountability. This comes from the 12 members of parliament. This is what they know. So this was my assignment. And as a political scientist, it's very difficult for me to go into the more medical things here. There are, for example, we have there are other people like me who work for this commission who, for example, study would this improve the medical results or not. And they compare, for example, Sweden with Denmark and Norway, where Norway have nationalized the big hospitals. Only the primary care is carried out at the city and municipality level. But that is sort of medical experts who are doing this, seeing if you get better medical results. Yeah. So I should have been clear that this was my assignment to try to figure out would a nationalization may improve democracy and accountability.
Yeah, I think it was clear enough for me to reconstruct it at least. So can I ask my second question? Sure. Like looking ahead, are there other challenges on the horizon that might inform our decision making about this topic? So like whether it should remain at the regional level or shift to the state level. So in particular, I come to think of at least 2 sort of developments that might have an impact on this. And one is the increasing reliance on private health insurance in Sweden, which might alter the sort of financial starting points of different individuals and also different regions, I guess. And the second issue is the increasing reliance on telehealth, or like you call your doctor on a video call, and then people who do this, I've only read the news about this, but this has put some economic strains on certain regions, because I don't know if the call is coming from one region but it's actually connected to a doctor in another. I don't know the details of this, but I've heard this in the media being discussed. So this might upset the regional the distribution of regions in Sweden even more, and speak in favor of, I guess, in favor of a sort of national single solution.
I mentioned the increase of private insurance in the report as an indicator that there are problems with the legitimacy and the operation of the public sector. But if you look carefully, it's gone up from very little to, I think it's now 600,000 such insurances. But for what I know, most of it, 90%, are and it's not private individuals who pay. It's private companies who want to make sure that key persons, unfortunately not university professors, but that they get treatment very quickly. So it's very few who pay this out of their own money. But of course, this is for people like I who have studied social policy for a long time. If you get such a system where people pay more and more out of their own pocket, people will of course not be willing to pay the high taxes. That is for sure. This is what happens in Latin America and in Eastern Europe a lot. The middle class say, why should we pay twice? So this is serious. But I think as long as it is not paid by the individual but by companies, it doesn't have this huge implication. The other thing I have to pass, I know too little about what is going on in this tele-doctor system. Maybe it will increase legitimacy because it makes it easier to get in contact. You don't have to make an appointment, you don't have to sit in the waiting room for 2 hours and so on. But I cannot really say how this will work. But I think you are right pointing out that this, because they take money from the public coffers, this can be an economic problem for them. But there are many others. Demography, for example. Now we have, there will be a huge problem in time because we'll have too few people who work in the system, and so on. So there are many other problems, of course. Yes, but I don't know if a shift to the national state will have an influence on these. The state cannot order people to have more babies in the country, luckily enough.
Thank you. And now we will take a question from the audience online. Rebecca.
Yes, hello. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, okay, perfect. Thank you. Rebecca Selberg, Institute for Future Studies, speaking to you today from Lund University. And I have a question, and I will ask it, and then I will give just a little bit of background, because otherwise the question will sound stupid. So the question is, what do you think that they want from nationalization, actually? So the background to this question is that I have done, over the course of 10 years, I think around 250 in-depth interviews with healthcare staff. And I think that, and all of the research that's being done, I think we know what the problems are. From research, certainly in the professions and at the level of operations, people have a very good understanding of the problems plaguing the healthcare system. But it seems to me when I do these interviews and when I sort of, do observations in the healthcare system at the level of operations, whatever the problem is, there is always one solution. And this solution is reorganizations. And it can be, there are 6 OBGYNs who hate each other and they're making life miserable. We'll organize the clinic. Or we have, too few ICU beds, and then we'll merge a hospital at some bureaucratic level, and then magically we hope the problem will disappear. It does not disappear, and then we split the clinics again, hoping to solve the basic problem, which is not enough ICU beds, not enough specialist nurses, etc. So really we have this situation where we have reorganization as routine to solve any problem within the healthcare system. And my question is, and I was really happy with your presentation because it gave me so many ideas about to actually combat substantial problems in a substantial way. But my suspicion is, and I know it's shared by many people in the healthcare system, that nationalization is another way of just saying, oh, we have all of these problems and we'll solve them with this magical thing, which is reorganization. So what do you think that they actually want? Thank you.
Let me speak out of the record. I think from analyzing political power, this will never happen. For a very simple reason. Large parts of those who are at the big parties' national conferences, the moderates, the social democrats, and they have a basis in regional politics, and they will not do away with themselves. So this will not happen. I cannot see that it will happen. And it's also one of the four parties that is actually having this. Why? What do they think? Well, I think there is an idea that if the state is doing things, it will be equal all over the country. I can assure you, it will not. Just look at the police. It doesn't work that way. So they have this idea that if we nationalize things, it will be completely universal. Like, yes, we have universal child allowances, but in child allowances, there is no loose coupling, right? So if the Minister of Social Affairs decides to increase by 100 kronas, every family will get 100 kronas. This is not how healthcare works, or education, because of this loose coupling problem and all the things that the state actually cannot influence. So I think this is a mirage. What I'm not saying that the state should abdicate. I say the state should do what the state is good at, enforce the laws and change the laws. And then I think there are, I'm a big fan of regional democracy. It's just a case that the Swedish one is not working well. But nothing says we couldn't, come up with a lot of ideas how it could be improved. This thought experiment is just to set this mindset going among the parliamentarians, that it doesn't have to be a replica of how the national system is organized. It could be organized in a very, very different way to make it very clear for voters that this is a very different election. Because I think this is possible, because coming back to the fact that healthcare is on top of the priorities when it comes to voters. It's just the case that they don't understand that it's the regions who run it. So this is sort of how should I say, a division of labor that I think is reasonable. The state does what the state is best, enforce the law and change the laws, and the regions could increase the understanding of what they do among voters. But I agree with you completely. People have this idea if we just reorganize, things would go well. If you work at the university department, this happens almost every day.
Thank you. And before I give the word to Andreas, I would like to say that there's still plenty of time for questions. So don't hesitate to raise a hand or a finger if you want to ask Bo something. Andreas, you're next.
Okay, thank you very much for a very interesting and thought-provoking presentation here. You already answered. I should say who I am. I'm Andreas Duit, Institute for Future Studies and Political Science, Stockholm University. You've already kind of answered my main question, which was really can nationalization of Swedish healthcare system actually happen? And I agree with you. I think it's just essentially a pipe dream. You know, there are too many reasons why it wouldn't work out. Even if they were to get it through Parliament, I still think it would be pretty much hopeless endeavor. But my other question was, well, what kind of nationalization are we talking about? Because you mainly listed the different varieties of how to govern this democratically, how to set up the democratic governance system, but you could also think of different ways of organizing nationalization. And, and also combine those with different ways of governing it would increase the manifolds even further, right? But you could think of nationalization as doing away with the regions altogether, or you could keep them but have them being run by a central agency or whatever. So do you have any thoughts on which of these organizational solutions might be preferable or might shine better with the democratic solution? So that would be... So that will be my one question. And my other question is, and I'm not sure if I got you right here, but I'm not entirely convinced that increased accountability, or at least, reforms aiming for increased accountability would actually make healthcare work better. Because there's also this issue about, maybe this is such a specialized activity that it's better left to the professionals. And maybe this is an area where we shouldn't have so much accountability, at least not on a detailed level. So what are your thoughts on that?
The first question is, and I should have mentioned this, if you completely nationalize healthcare, you cannot reasonably keep the regions. I mean, it's 90% of what they are doing. And there is a lot of critique of the regions. 2 former high-level Swedish ministers wrote an op-ed 3-4 months into the COVID crisis in Dagens Nyheter. Lars... They were both social democrats, and they have been ministers for a long time. Close to regions, they said. We have 4 former ministers of healthcare from different sides of the political who are now criticized, also in Dagens Nyheter, the regions for not... There is a law saying you have the right to a permanent contact with your primary caregiver. The regions completely do away with it. And they say we cannot have this, we have laws and the regions just don't follow them. But if you would close down the regions, we would also have to send home some 5,000-6,000 Swedish politicians. Now, in Sweden we've gone from, if you go back to the 1960s, some 220,000 elected persons, to today we have, I think, 37,000. At that time it meant that in every, what you say, extended family, there was one person who was elected to something, the local school board or whatever. So they were not like, other people. Today it's 1 out of 450. I'm not sure that sending home 5,000 of these 37,000 would improve the Swedish democracy. This is also off the record, but I'm now playing around with an idea that we want representativeness when it comes to values and standpoints, åsikts. Then we want social representativeness when it comes to class and gender and whatever. But I'm now playing around along with a concept that I call mental responsibility. We cannot have politicians who are mentally very, very different from us. I mean, some of them I think are extremely narcissists, for example. We must sort of feel... So I think this is a main problem. Then your other question, just say one word. The second question.
Accountability.
Yeah, good. There is one person in this room, I will not say who it is, who told me that he completely lost trust in democratic politics when those who were responsible for all the problems with the new Karolinska Hospital Institute in Sweden got re-elected. That was it. I won't say who it was. But, you know, there are such things that are not working in the regional politics. For example, in southern Sweden, in Skåne, there is seems to be a big majority for increasing taxes for the regions, because Skåne has some of the absolute lowest taxes. But it doesn't translate into actual politics, because people don't vote for those who would like to increase the taxes. So the taxes are still among the lowest in the, even though opinion polls show that most people would like to see higher taxes. So I agree with you that in many, that is why I said have this section about what should democracy be about. There are lots of sections where you cannot really have accountability. But there are issues. For example, building this new, all the scandals, building this new, or in Skåne about the tax level, where I think it doesn't work. People don't know what they are voting for when they vote. They vote in blind, I think.
Thank you. And on that note, I would like to we would like to thank Bo for this very interesting talk. And before you all leave, I would just like to say a few words about our upcoming seminars. So already next week, on November 20th, we will have in-house Kari Andén Papadopoulos, who will talk about justice by digital open source research, visual evidence and the limits of the legal regime of truth. And on November 27th, we will have Eres Magor talking about bidenomics, industrial policy, and the 21st century American developmental state. Thank you.
Thank you.